What if you discovered your great-grandmother once raised a Bigfoot child? And what if that creature is still alive, watching from the woods behind your house? We found an old wooden chest buried in our family's attic. Inside was a weathered journal from 1897, and what it revealed gave us chills. Turns out, an Irish-born Mountie named Patrick Callahan rescued a wild, growling child, found beside the grave of a giant female, a creature hunters claimed was the mother. Patrick couldn't bring himself to kill the boy. He brought him home. The child, later named Kaelen, drank from puddles, snarled like a beast, but clung to a teddy bear at night. He was raised alongside Patrick's stepdaughter, my great-grandmother, until one day he vanished into the snow. This isn't just legend. Patrick was real. The towns, the names, all match. And we're his descendants, holding the original journal in our hands. Stay with this video and you'll learn what happens when a Bigfoot is raised among humans, why Kaelen disappeared even after being loved like a son, and the haunting reason my great-grandmother never spoke of him again. His name was Kaelen. He left without a sound, except for the howl we still hear every winter from the hills behind our home. Miss this video, and you may never question the boundary between human and wild again. The box smelled like pine and smoke. Not the kind from a fire just lit, but the kind that lingers in old clothes, old papers, old grief. Amanda ran her fingers along the lid, tracing the iron hinges dulled by decades. Roger didn't speak. He just waited, eyes locked on the rusted latch that had once belonged to their grandmother's armoire, now bolted to this homemade chest like some quiet promise no one had dared open in years. She exhaled, slow, and lifted it. The lid creaked. Inside, letters tied with twine, brittle paper tucked between fabric scraps, a pressed cedar sprig so dry it turned to dust at her touch. Then, near the bottom, a small bundle wrapped in faded navy wool. Amanda pulled it out. The fabric was worn smooth, like it had been held many times, and the scent that came off it was unmistakable. Resin, leather, tobacco, and something colder beneath it. Ink. She unwrapped it carefully. A journal. Its edges were frayed, the pages yellowed and speckled, but the spine still held. On the front cover, stamped faintly in black, P. Callahan. Then underneath, a red wax seal half broken, barely legible now, but the crest of the Northwest Mounted Police was still visible if you tilted it toward the light. Roger leaned closer. "That's him," he whispered. "Patrick." Amanda nodded. Her fingers hovered over the first page. She hesitated, then turned it. Inside, the handwriting sloped in clean, deliberate lines, fading at the edges. The first few pages were neat, dated, labeled, equipment logs, travel records, weather summaries. But further in, the writing grew rushed, less formal, more human. Then a page with a small piece of twine knotted through the corner. A bookmark. Just before the knot, a single sentence stretched across the page, written in a paler ink as if the pen had started to run dry. "I couldn't leave the child behind." Amanda froze. Her thumb rested just below the words. Something sank in her chest, soft and heavy. She looked up. "That line," she said. "That's exactly what Grandma used to tell us, word for word." Roger didn't reply. He was staring at the fire, the way flames reflected in his glasses. Not warm, not cozy, just flickering. Like they both knew this wasn't going to be a comforting tale. She turned the page again. The air seemed to shift. Winter. That's what the page whispered first. You could almost hear it. Wind scouring a valley, distant creaking of pines under ice, the sharp ring of an axe on wet wood. Patrick's words painted it not with flourishes, but with texture. Boots crunching through crusted snow, the sting of air so dry it cracked your lips in minutes. He described patrols north of Farwell, A tiny outpost barely more than a cluster of cabins and a flagpole planted in half-frozen earth. He was stationed alone most days, sometimes joining 2 others for boundary checks, disputes, timber claims, and traps laid too close to settler homes. "They come to us for law," he wrote, "but the woods have their own." There were mentions of names: Etienne Rousseau, Marielle Toussaint, Elodie. People he passed by more than knew, locals, loggers. One a widow, the other a farmer who sold smoked trout from a wooden shack on the banks of the Île Sylvaet. But it wasn't until 3 pages later that Patrick's tone shifted. It wasn't what he said. It was how the ink pressed harder into the page. He started using shorter lines, sentences clipped like his thoughts were racing ahead of his hand. That was when the twine reappeared, looped through a page now frayed where fingers had tugged it over and over. Amanda paused. Her throat felt tight, though she hadn't spoken. She smoothed the paper. The next words came like a bruise. "Found her grave, fresh soil, shallow, not enough stones." The next line trembled. Child wouldn't leave her side. It wasn't just what he'd seen. It was what he'd felt. The kind of dread that came not from danger, but from the knowledge you were standing before something sacred and broken at the same time. He described the clearing. Snow churned by something larger than a man. The scent of rot carried on a windless day. A trap snapped and stained with hair. Then the child. Not human. Not animal. Somewhere between. Fur matted in frost. Eyes too wide, too bright, hiding behind the grave. Patrick had reached for his revolver and stopped. Not from fear. From something colder. Recognition. "I don't know what I saw," he wrote. "But I saw grief." Amanda closed the book a moment. She didn't realize her hands were trembling until the journal fell slightly in her lap. Roger leaned forward, picked up a folded piece of paper that had slipped from between the pages. It was a sketch, rough pencil strokes, a mound of earth with 3 stones, a sapling planted crooked behind it, and beside it, small and hunched, a figure drawn in shadow. Arms wrapped around bent knees, watching. Neither of them said anything. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window pane like fingertips tapping glass. The fire popped. Amanda opened the book again. She flipped to the end of that entry. "Luke said kill it, said it ain't right. I couldn't." There was a pause in the journal, 3 blank lines. And then, I sat down, I stayed. The journal described the days after. The weather worsening. The traps iced over. The way Patrick returned again and again to that clearing. Sometimes alone, sometimes bringing small things, a wool scarf, a piece of jerky. Then, on the 3rd day, a toy. A carved wooden horse. Elodie's. The child didn't speak, didn't come close, but it didn't run anymore. I waited. I offered. I listened. Roger reached into the chest again. There, near the bottom, buried under years of newspaper clippings and yellowed envelopes, was a small bundle wrapped in canvas. He unfolded it. Inside, a child's toy, a wooden horse. One leg snapped. Amanda covered her mouth. They looked at each other. No words. Just the weight of something ancient, something that pressed in from all sides like cold earth packed around a coffin. She turned one final page for the night. There, scribbled in handwriting far less steady than before. She looked like she understood, like she remembered me, and still, she didn't come closer. No signature, just a pressed cedar sprig at the bottom of the page, fragile but still intact. The wind outside moaned, low and hollow. Amanda shut the journal gently, almost as if not to wake something. She looked at Roger, who hadn't moved. "That line," she said again. "I couldn't leave the child behind." Roger nodded. They didn't have to say it out loud. They believed him. But more importantly, if they didn't, the story would vanish. And whatever Patrick had tried to protect, whatever he had sacrificed law and order and reason for, would vanish with it. The room felt colder now, but not empty. Amanda leaned back, eyes still on the journal. Somewhere inside, The story hadn't ended. It had only turned the page. The morning broke with a low ceiling of clouds, thick and gray, dragging across the peaks like a promise of snow. Patrick Callahan saddled up before sunrise, wool coat buttoned tight, gloves stiff from the cold. He scribbled a line into his duty logbook just before he left the outpost. Welfare check, North Trail, per local report. Then tucked it into the canvas pouch behind his saddle. It was the kind of notation no one would question. Just enough ink to make the trip official. Just enough space to decide later what it really meant. He carried with him a small cloth bag. Inside, a handful of striped taffy candies, an old tin whistle, and a carved birch toy he'd traded from a vendor weeks earlier. It was meant for Elodie, Marielle's daughter. Something about the girl's laugh made Patrick feel like winter might not last forever. He figured he'd stop by, drop off the sweets, then ride north and handle the story he'd heard the night before. The roads weren't really roads this time of year, just rutted tracks half swallowed by snow, iced over by melt and refreeze. His horse, Donner, moved steady but slow. The air stung his nose hairs. Pines lined the trail like silent judges, and the deeper he rode into the hills, the more the world pressed in. No sound but hoofbeats, no wind, just the breath of the land holding itself tight. By mid-morning, the first sign of life appeared, smoke curling out of a crooked chimney near a trading shack that doubled as a whiskey stop. Patrick tied off Donner and ducked into the dark doorway. Inside, it smelled like burnt fat and wet wool. A wood stove in the corner hissed. Two men sat at a table cluttered with shot glasses and grease-stained cards. One was Luke Morel. Luke squinted through a haze of drink and smoke. "You heard yet?" he rasped, lips purple from cold or liquor, maybe both. Patrick unbuttoned his coat slowly. "Heard what?" Luke nodded toward the man across from him, then back to Patrick. "Big one. Caught in a spring trap, just up from the Rousseau line. She tore herself near in half trying to get out. Dead now. Maybe 2 days." Patrick didn't flinch. "A bear." Luke smirked. "Not unless bears wear necklaces and cry for their dead." The other man chuckled, low and broken. Patrick stared. Luke leaned forward, breath sour. "Swear on my mother. Rousseau buried it this morning. Wouldn't say much, just kept muttering about curses and spirits. But here's the thing, he said there was another, smaller. Wouldn't leave the body." Patrick's hand hovered near his coat buttons again, fingers tightening. "You saw it?" Luke licked his lips. "No, but Etienne did. Said the little one was crouched beside the grave. Wouldn't budge, just stayed, hissing like a cat." Patrick stayed silent. Let the words sink. Luke lowered his voice. "You ask me, it's half human. Some freak bred in the woods too long. You can't let a thing like that live. What if it wanders into a camp? What if it's got teeth like hers?" Patrick stood slowly. "You report this to anyone else?" Luke shrugged. "Told you. That's enough, ain't it?" Patrick didn't answer. He stepped out without finishing his tea. Outside, Donner pawed the snow. Patrick mounted and turned north. The trees grew taller here. Closer. The kind of thick that muffled sound and memory. You could ride a mile and forget what the sun looked like. By noon, the light was already dimming. He passed the Rousseau trailhead and veered right, following a line of boot prints already filling with snow. The scent hit him first. Not fresh, not rot, but something thick and sweet and wrong. Then the crows. He dismounted near a clearing where the snow had been trampled, where branches bent in unnatural directions. Patrick walked slow, one hand on the grip of his sidearm, the other holding nothing but breath. There was a mound of earth, recently packed, a rough wooden cross staked at the head. It leaned to one side. Shovel marks froze mid-scoop in the ground, jagged and hurried. Around the grave were footprints, not boots, bare, wide, deep. Donner stomped and shuddered behind him, nostrils flaring. Patrick hushed him gently, then turned toward the trees. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, just the wind moving needles. But no, there, Behind a thick root-twisted pine, barely visible in the shadows, a pair of eyes gleamed, low to the ground, unblinking, watching. Patrick didn't move. Neither did the child. He could see now, matted fur, small limbs curled in tight, ribs visible even under the coat of hair. It was breathing fast. The snow around it had melted to a shallow hollow. Then it hissed. Not loud, not animal, just warning. Patrick didn't draw his weapon. He didn't speak. He knelt slowly, pressed a gloved hand into the snow, and looked at the grave. He saw the coil of rusted spring trap chain half buried behind the cross, blood frozen on its teeth, the air around it heavy with what had happened. Then came the sound behind him. Luke. He'd followed, slower, louder, dragging his boots and breath like a man with something to prove. "Is it here?" Luke said, shotgun slung low. "Did you see it?" Patrick stood up, put himself between Luke and the grave. "It's here," he said. Luke cocked his head. "So what now? You gonna write it a ticket?" Patrick said nothing. Luke stepped closer. "We end this now. Clean. I'll do it." He reached for the strap on his shoulder. Patrick stepped forward. "No." Luke laughed, dry and sharp. "You soft? That thing ain't natural." Patrick's voice was steady. "It's grieving." Luke looked past him, saw the shape behind the tree. "That ain't grief. That's a mistake." Patrick moved again. One step, just enough to block Luke's sight line. "You'll have to shoot through me." Luke stared. Mouth twitched. The cold made his eyes water. For a second, no one breathed. Then Luke spat into the snow. "Your funeral." He turned and walked back, muttering curses as his boots crunched away. Patrick didn't move until the sound disappeared into the woods. Then he turned back. The child was still there, still watching. He knelt again. He didn't reach out, didn't speak, just sat. Wind stirred. The trees creaked. The grave sat silent between them. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then, slowly, Patrick took the cloth pouch from his coat, unwrapped it, pulled out a piece of taffy and set it on the snow. Just far enough away, just close enough to be seen. He didn't expect the child to move, but it did. Crawled forward, inch by inch, fingers twitching in the snow. It didn't blink. It didn't look at him. It took the candy and retreated again, back to the hollow behind the tree. Patrick stayed, not because he had to, but because no one else would. And even if no one ever believed him, even if this moment was buried under years in doubt, he would remember. The child had not left its mother, and he had not left the child. Not this time. Not again. The light began to fall, thin and gold, through the trees. The shadows grew long. The grave held its silence. Somewhere far off, a tree branch knocked against another, once, twice, then 3 times. But Patrick didn't turn. He just kept watching the edge of the woods, where the child's eyes still glowed, soft as coals under snow. The smell of fry bread drifted through the windows before Patrick even reached the house. Marielle had that way about her, cooking like someone trying to keep ghosts warm. He could see her through the slatted curtain, bent over the fire, her back wrapped in a faded green shawl, moving slow but deliberate. The child, Elodie, sat on the floor near her feet, humming something tuneless, one hand wrapped around the leg of a cloth-stuffed bear, the other spinning the toy Patrick had brought just 2 days ago, a little whistle with no sound left in it. He hadn't expected to stop here. Not yet, but after what he'd seen, he didn't want to go back to the outpost. He needed the steadiness of Marielle's kitchen, needed the smoke and spice and salt to rinse off what still clung to him. He knocked once. Marielle turned, wiped her hands on her apron. Elodie ran to the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, as if she already knew he wasn't just here to bring more candy. "Come in, Patrick," Marielle said gently, as she always did. He stepped inside. The warmth hit him first, then the smell, then the stillness, like even the walls were holding their breath. He stood in the middle of the room, gloved hands still at his sides. His voice came out lower than he meant. "I need to talk to you." Marielle didn't ask why. She just gestured to the bench near the hearth and poured hot water into a cup. No tea, just heat. She sat beside him, eyes already narrowing with something between worry and recognition. Patrick didn't know how to explain what had happened. Not without sounding out of his mind. Not without dragging her into something she couldn't walk away from. So he just said it plain. "There's a child. Not like ours. Alone. It won't leave the grave of its mother, I think." Marielle didn't move. "I saw the body," he added. "It's big." She was caught in a spring trap, torn up bad, buried now. But the child's still there, won't eat, won't move, just sits in the snow. He waited for the disbelief, for the cross of herself, for the sign that he was talking to the wrong person. But Marielle only reached for the kettle again and filled another cup. "How long has it been there?" Patrick blinked. 3 days, I think. Maybe more." She nodded once. Not approval, not understanding, just decision. "I'll come," she said. "You can't." "I'll come," she said again. And this time, she was already standing, already gathering what she needed. A shawl, a headscarf, a cloth bag. She called out for Elodie, who perked up and ran to her without hesitation. The girl wrapped her arms around her mother's legs as Marielle tied the scarf around her head, knotting it tight beneath her chin. She reached for a fresh fry bread cooling on the windowsill and broke it in half. One piece went into a tin, the other into Elodie's tiny hands. Patrick stood there, useless. "I can't bring you out there. It's too cold. It's too—" "She stays with me," Marielle said, pulling Elodie's coat off the hook. "There's no one to watch her." Patrick hesitated, then nodded. Outside, they loaded the wagon. A small sack of flour, 2 jars of clean water, a canister of coarse salt. No one spoke. The road was rough, and the clouds were lowering again, pushing down on them like they didn't belong out there. But Marielle didn't flinch. Elodie sat between them, hands tucked under her legs, a look on her face like she knew not to ask questions. The child was clever. She'd been born in winter and raised in silence. She understood how to listen. They reached the clearing just before dusk. The grave looked the same. Fresh packed soil. Cross still crooked. But the air was different. Colder. Still. Patrick dismounted first, then helped Marielle down. She didn't wait for him. She moved toward the trees, slow and careful, like someone entering church after the sermon had started. Elodie followed, her steps small but steady. Then they saw it. Behind the same tree, tucked into the same hollow, the child was still there. Thinner, eyes sunken deeper, but still watching, still refusing to move. Marielle didn't speak, didn't look directly. She crouched near the grave and set down the tin of bread, opened it, tore off a corner and placed it on the snow. Then another piece, then a third. She uncorked the water and poured some into a wooden cup. Set that beside the bread. Her hands didn't tremble. Then she sat. Elodie hovered near her, clutching her mother's shawl. Patrick watched. No one moved. Minutes passed. Then the child twitched. Its fingers gripped the ground. Its eyes darted to the bread. Then the water. Then back to Marielle. She didn't flinch. Didn't reach. Didn't smile. She just whispered, barely audible, "It's okay." The child inched forward. Barely. The smell hit again. Sour sweat, decay, something earthy and wild. But Marielle didn't lean away. She tore off another piece of bread and placed it a few feet closer. The child's hand shot out and grabbed it, shoved it into its mouth. It chewed, eyes locked on Marielle. Then it whimpered. Elodie stepped forward. Her hand clutched something small, a wooden toy Patrick had brought earlier. She held it out, not too close, not too far. Her face was open. Her mouth curved into a nervous smile. The child stared, then whimpered again, then cried. Not loud, just enough to break whatever had frozen inside it. Patrick felt something in his throat tighten. The child crawled the rest of the way forward, dropped to its knees, and clutched at the bread. It didn't speak, didn't make a sound, just ate and cried, and kept its eyes on Elodie the whole time. That night, Patrick built a fire not far from the grave, just enough to keep the cold from biting into the child's bones. They wrapped it in a wool blanket. Marielle took her own shawl off her back and laid it across its shoulders. They didn't ask for names. They didn't question the shape of its face. They just gave it warmth. The child lay near Elodie that night, curled tight around the old bear she offered. It didn't speak, but it didn't hiss either. Just breathed. Just existed. Marielle watched the fire flicker across its fur. Patrick sat with his knees bent, elbows on thighs, eyes unfocused. In the silence, the wind rattled branches. Elodie leaned against her mother's arm, her eyes still wide. Patrick finally spoke. "I don't think it has anyone else." Marielle nodded. "We don't leave children," she said softly. And Patrick knew, even without her saying it, that whatever lines had once separated duty from heart were gone. The next morning they packed quietly. Elodie climbed onto the wagon without complaint. The child followed. Marielle helped it up like she would any other, and for the first time it didn't resist. It sat beside Elodie, still, silent, but not alone. Patrick watched the forest fade behind them, watched the grave disappear under snow, watched the place where the child had waited vanish into memory. And even as the wagon creaked back toward town, even as smoke curled from Marielle's chimney far in the distance, he knew something had followed them. Not a threat, not a curse, just a life that refused to die. And somewhere, under all the frost and fear, something ancient had just begun to thaw. The child didn't know what a house was. It stepped over the threshold like a wounded thing, half expecting the walls to close in or the fire to bite. It moved on all fours at first, then dropped to a crouch beside the doorway and sniffed the wooden floor. Marielle didn't speak. She held Elodie on her hip and waited near the hearth, letting the heat do the welcoming for her. Patrick stood just behind the child, not blocking the way, but close enough to step in if something went wrong. The child, too lean, too quiet, shuffled forward. The floor creaked beneath it, but it didn't flinch. It crouched by the wood stove, eyes flicking from the flames to the shadows on the ceiling like it was trying to make sense of it all. Then it saw the cup, a plain wooden cup left on the table's edge, still holding half an inch of water from Elodie's breakfast. The child lunged, knocking it over with a slap. Water spilled across the boards. It dropped to its belly and licked it up, fast and loud, like a starving dog. Patrick stepped forward instinctively, but Marielle held up a hand. "Let it." The child gulped and choked, not stopping to breathe. Marielle moved slowly, picked up the cup, refilled it at the jug by the sink, and brought it back. She knelt low, extended the cup again, both hands open. The child stared, sniffed, snatched the cup and dumped half of it on the floor, then lapped at that too. Marielle didn't scold. She got a rag, wiped the boards clean, and poured again. This time the child drank slower. The room exhaled. Elodie watched from the corner, still holding her bear. She didn't speak either. That night, Patrick rode back to the outpost. He didn't sleep. He kept hearing the soft licking on the floorboards and the strange rhythm of the child's breath, like someone who'd never known peace, not once. At sunrise, he returned with a sack of oats, salt pork, and a box of nails. He stepped off his horse and saw Marielle already on the porch, holding Elodie, both of them wrapped in the same thick blanket. "They're still asleep," she said. Patrick raised an eyebrow. "Both of them," she clarified. He followed her inside. The child lay curled beside the hearth, Elodie's bear tucked under one arm, its face buried in a wool blanket Marielle had patched last winter. Its breathing was steady, its hands unclenched. Patrick didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching. Later that morning, Marielle brought out some soft bread soaked in milk. The child ate with its hands. No hesitation, no shame. It bit too fast and gagged more than once, but it kept going. Marielle never pulled away, never hovered. She kept her movements slow, deliberate. She offered a wooden spoon, which the child sniffed, held like a rock, then dropped. Elodie pointed and said, "Spoon." The child blinked. Marielle repeated it gently. "Spoon." The child didn't echo, but something shifted in its posture, something that made Patrick write in his journal that night. She's teaching it without saying so. By the third day, it was clear the child wasn't going to run. It stayed close to the stove, closer to Elodie, never quite looking her in the eyes, but always within reach of her shadow. It hadn't spoken, not once, but when Patrick brought in fresh water from the well, it grunted. When Marielle lit the stove, it pressed its fingers to the floor and leaned toward the flame like it wanted to memorize the heat. They named it on the fourth day, not by ceremony, not with papers. Marielle looked up from folding laundry and said, "We can't keep calling him it." Patrick didn't answer. Elodie whispered something that sounded like Kaelen. Patrick paused. Marielle looked at her daughter, then nodded. Kaelen. The name stuck. It didn't mean anything in English or French or Irish, but it sounded soft enough to belong. That night, Patrick came home from the outpost carrying news. He stepped off his horse slower than usual. His gloves didn't come off right away. Marielle knew something had gone wrong. He sat at the table, laid his hat beside the lamp, and said, "Etienne Rousseau's dead." Marielle's breath caught. "How?" "Fell into the river. Maybe ice cracked under him. They pulled him out yesterday. Sheriff sent word." Elodie looked up. Kaelen sat in the corner, chewing a piece of salted meat. Patrick looked at him. "He doesn't know," Marielle said quietly. Patrick nodded. "Should he?" Marielle didn't answer. They let the question stay there between them like frost that hadn't melted yet. That night, Kaelen slept close to Elodie for the first time. She wrapped her bear between them, tucked under both their chins. Marielle sat nearby, sewing patches into a wool blanket by candlelight. Patrick watched from the doorway, not saying a word. Kaelen's breathing didn't change, but his hand curled gently around the bear's arm. By the end of the week, he started mimicking words. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to make Elodie laugh. Spoon became spa. Blanket became blah. The rhythm was slow, like learning to walk again, but there was effort. Marielle praised him gently. Elodie clapped. The boy smiled once, only once, but it was enough. Patrick wrote in his log, "I think I've accepted a son." He crossed the sentence out, then wrote it again, this time darker, harder pressed. The name stayed Kaelen. He never flinched when they called him that, never tried to correct it. And even though he didn't speak it himself, he responded when Elodie whispered it through the hallway, or when Marielle sang it under her breath while stirring oats on the stove. Kaelen, like it had always been his, like something about it had waited all this time to be said. And even though he still startled when strangers came to the door, even though he hid when footsteps crunched on snow outside, even though he never touched the spoons, they kept calling him that, and he kept staying. Kaelen didn't learn like other children. He didn't need words to understand weight or repetition to remember pain. He watched once, maybe twice, then acted as if he'd always known. Patrick noticed it the first time he split a log in front of him. Kaelen sat at the edge of the porch, elbows on knees, eyes locked on the swing of the axe. Patrick thought nothing of it. But when he turned his back to stack the cut pieces, he heard a second crack, sharp, clean, and turned around to find Kaelen gripping the axe handle in both hands, breath steady, feet braced. A second log lay split in half at his feet. He hadn't asked. He hadn't smiled. He just looked up, waiting. Patrick said nothing at first, just handed him another piece of wood. And Kaelen raised the axe again. It became part of the rhythm after that. Mornings were for firewood. Patrick cut a piece, Kaelen followed. By the third day, the boy's swings were better than his own, precise, balanced, not wild. There was no fury in it, just need. Still, not everything came as easy. The bathing was a battle. Marielle had tried to keep it gentle. Warm water in the basin. Soft cloth. Elodie humming by the hearth to keep things light. But the moment she brought the damp rag to Kaelen's back, something in him snapped. He jerked away, teeth bared, shoulders hunched like a cornered animal. He let out a noise. Not a scream, but a sound that didn't belong in a house, like something old being disturbed from underground. Then his hand clamped onto Elodie's arm. Fast, hard, unthinking. She slipped, gasped, fell into the basin. Water sloshed onto the floorboards, her mouth wide with shock. Marielle yelled, sharper than she ever had. Patrick was already moving. He grabbed Kaelen's wrists, pulled him back, twisted just enough to break the grip. The boy thrashed once, then froze. His eyes locked on Elodie's dripping hair, the way she sat stunned on the floor. Something flickered behind his eyes. Then his legs gave. He dropped to his knees, shoulders trembling. He didn't cry. He didn't run. He just looked down at his own hands like he didn't understand what they'd done. Marielle gathered Elodie into her arms, whispering comfort, fingers stroking soaked hair. Patrick crouched beside Kaelen, heart still pounding. The boy wouldn't meet his eyes. That night they laid out a new rule. Kaelen and Elodie were never to be alone in the same room. Any time she reached for him, an adult had to be there. Not because they didn't trust him, but because they knew something inside him still belonged to the dark. Patrick carved the rule into wood and nailed it above the hearth, not for the boy, but for themselves. A reminder, a boundary. And yet, by morning, Elodie was sitting next to Kaelen again. She didn't seem afraid. She pressed her favorite grouse feather into his palm and whispered, "Gentle." Kaelen didn't respond, but he held the feather for hours. It snowed the next day, fat flakes drifting down over the tree line like a hush from heaven. The world turned soft, quiet. Patrick took Kaelen into the woods near the ridge where birds nested low and slow. He showed him how to walk heel first, how to watch the branches for rustle instead of sound. Then he pointed, a ptarmigan, hunched and half buried in snow. Kaelen picked up a stone. Patrick opened his mouth to explain. Too late. The boy flung it like a bullet. The bird dropped instantly. Clean kill. Not a sound. Patrick let out a slow breath. Nodded once. Kaelen looked back only to confirm. That was the start of their hunting days. Later, Kaelen brought down a deer. Too fast. Patrick hadn't seen him move. 1 second he was crouched in the underbrush. The next he was sprinting, faster than any boy had a right to be. The deer panicked. Kaelen drove it into a deadfall, wrestled it to the ground, held it until it stopped moving. No weapon, no snare, just arms and instinct. Patrick had to pry him off. Kaelen was panting, not out of breath, but out of control. His hands twitched, his shoulders shook. Not from exhaustion. From hunger, Patrick butchered the animal himself. The meat was tough, gamey. Kaelen didn't mind. That evening, while Marielle cooked grouse over the fire, Kaelen sat by the window. He'd begun doing that more often, right before dusk. Watching, waiting. The house settled into its evening rhythm. Elodie stacked kindling. Marielle hummed an old tune from her girlhood. Patrick polished the hatchet. Then it came, a sound from beyond the ridge. Low, long, a howl, but not from a wolf. Higher, human in shape, not in soul. The kind of sound that made the marrow shift. Kaelen turned his head, just slightly, like it was calling him. Patrick noticed. "Coyotes," he said. But even Marielle didn't believe it. The next night, the same howl, closer, more insistent. Kaelen's body stiffened, his nostrils flared. He answered, not with a word, with a sound of his own. Not quite human, not quite safe. Patrick made a mark in his notebook. Marielle tightened the latch on the front door. The calls came again, almost every dusk. 3 long cries stretched over the treetops, fading into the hills. Kaelen answered each time, louder, clearer, like language. like memory. Elodie once asked, "Is that his mama?" No one answered. That week, Patrick married Marielle. Quietly. No guests. Just the two of them standing outside the cabin beneath the cedar tree where Elodie used to hide. The sun was low. Their hands were bare. She wore the same shawl she'd wrapped around Kaelen that first night. Patrick didn't shave. She didn't wear shoes. It didn't matter. There was no ceremony, no vow. Just a moment, simple and still, where they looked at each other and knew there was no turning back. Elodie clapped. Kaelen didn't understand, but he watched. Patrick kept the single photo they took that day folded inside the front of his field journal. A traveling photographer had passed through town 2 months earlier, and Marielle insisted they get one picture, just in case time swallows everything else. They stood stiffly, awkwardly, her hand on Patrick's chest, Elodie in the middle, and Kaelen off to the side, staring into the lens like he'd seen something hidden in its eye. The man handed them the print and said, "Strange family, but it works." They never saw him again. But the photo remained, flat, fragile, like a window to a life that could shatter with the wrong question. That night, Elodie curled up under the wedding quilt with her bear and whispered something to Kaelen as he lay on the floor beside her bed. He didn't answer, but he didn't sleep either. He stared at the ceiling, eyes open, body still, listening. Beyond the walls, the wind rose. Somewhere in the trees, another howl began to rise, this time closer, lower, and Kaelen's breath caught in his throat, not out of fear, but recognition. And outside, under the snow-thick sky, something ancient waited for his answer. Kaelen was 13 the winter he stopped answering to the roof above his head. The house was still his shelter, but not his boundary. He'd begun slipping out before dawn, always barefoot, leaving no prints in the snow until they reappeared hours, sometimes days, later, stained with pine needles, dried mud, or blood he never explained. The first time he disappeared, they waited until sunset. Marielle paced the kitchen, boiled water for a bath he never came back to. Patrick lit the lanterns early and sat with a loaded rifle by the window. Not for protection, but because it felt like the only thing he could hold. Elodie stayed up until her eyes gave out. Kaelen returned near midnight. He didn't speak, just stood outside in the snow, hair wet, chest rising and falling like he'd been running. Patrick opened the door. Kaelen didn't come in, not right away. He just looked behind him, into the forest, then at the sky. Then, slowly, he stepped over the threshold like he was crossing into someone else's world. He said nothing the next morning either. But when Patrick checked his boots by the door, he found a patch of fur tucked inside. Long, dark, too fine for deer, too clean for coyote. He tucked it in the journal without a word. By the second disappearance, Patrick started counting. 1 night, then 2, then 3. The distances grew with the silence. And when Kaelen returned, his body was leaner, arms more defined, his scent sharper, wilder, mixed with tree sap and moss, and something that reminded Patrick of caves and breath held too long. He brought back feathers, bones, small bundles of animal sinew wrapped with bark cord. Not offerings, not trophies, signs. The family learned to wait. Quietly. They never locked the door. Marielle folded an extra quilt every night and left it by the fire. Elodie began setting out a tin cup filled with fresh water. Sometimes it was gone by morning. Sometimes it sat untouched, a ring of dew circling it like a question left unanswered. One weekend, Marielle insisted they visit her uncle's farm near the old train spur, far enough east that the trees thinned and the neighbors' opinions thickened. They hadn't seen those relatives since Kaelen was small, before the boy grew into the mystery people could no longer excuse. Marielle packed bread, ham, and jars of pickled eggs. Elodie wore her red knit scarf. Kaelen didn't speak the whole ride. He sat in the back of the wagon, back hunched, eyes fixed on the passing trees like he was memorizing the escape routes. The farm was wide open, windy, Fields rolled like old bones under thin snow. Her Uncle Claude met them at the gate. Tall, leather-skinned, his voice rough from decades of hay and war stories. He hugged Marielle hard, shook Patrick's hand like they were still men who wore badges, then glanced once at Kaelen and said nothing. Lunch was heavy with silence. No one asked about school. No one dared ask where the boy came from. It wasn't until coffee that Claude spoke. "You ever think maybe it ain't yours to keep?" Patrick stiffened. Claude sipped, slow. "I mean it. Wild things belong to the wild. That boy, he ain't made for walls. You know that." Marielle's jaw clenched. "He's our son," Patrick said softly. Claude leaned back. "You raise a wolf in the house? Don't be surprised when it starts looking at the chickens different." Elodie dropped her fork. Kaelen hadn't touched his plate. He hadn't moved since they sat. But his shoulders rose, then sank, and when he looked up, there was no hatred in his eyes. Just distance. Like he already knew this conversation would come, had come, would come again. That evening, as the wagon turned back west, the air fell quiet between the trees. No one spoke until the sky darkened to charcoal and the first owl call stirred. Then came the sound, that same old howl, drawn low across the ridgeline, full of breath and sorrow. But this time, it wasn't alone. From deeper in the valley came a response, softer, echoed. 3 hard knocks from the trees, spaced evenly, deliberate, like someone or something was speaking back. Kaelen didn't flinch. He sat taller. Marielle saw his hand twitch, fingers flexing on the edge of the wagon like he was holding back a wave. That night no one slept. Just before dawn, Kaelen stood at the door. Didn't ask, didn't explain. He just nodded once toward the woods and stepped out barefoot, into snow lit by moonlight and memory. He didn't return that day, or the next. On the 5th morning, Marielle found a small bundle wrapped in moss outside the door. Inside, grouse feathers, a wet clump of black hair, and one of Elodie's carved buttons, burned around the edges but whole. She closed her fist around it and whispered his name once. From then on, the howls became part of the rhythm. Sunset brought them like the tolling of a bell. And Kaelen, when he returned, stood longer at the edge of the woods before stepping inside. He didn't cross the threshold without hesitation anymore. There was a line forming there, invisible but sharp, and he knew it. And every time he came back, it seemed to take more of him just to step across. One evening, as the sun bled behind the ridge and Marielle set out fresh fry bread and a clay cup on the porch, Elodie stood beside her mother and asked, "Will he leave forever?" Marielle didn't answer, but when they turned to go inside, Kaelen stood on the ridge above the house. Tall now, wind at his back, arms by his sides, and for the first time, he waved, just once, slow, grateful, like he was saying thank you without having to learn the words. Then he turned toward the woods and vanished. The fry bread was gone by morning, but the cup stayed full. Not a drop spilled, just a smudge of ash on the rim and a faint wet print where fingers had held it gently, without hunger, without fear. Somewhere out there, the forest had answered its call, and Kaelen had started to listen, but he hadn't forgotten how to say goodbye. Not yet. The porch had started to gray with frost by the time Marielle stepped out each evening. She'd grown used to the chill crawling under her shawl, the way her hands stiffened around the plate. She never forgot the bread. Still warm, still torn by hand the way he liked it. No butter, no honey, just bread. And beside it, a wooden cup filled with water, left exactly where the morning sun had last hit the step. She set them down slowly, her breath fogging in front of her lips, and stayed just long enough to see the steam rise before turning back inside. Kaelen hadn't crossed the threshold in over a month, not since that last wave. He came still, at night, in the fog, at the edge of the clearing, but never closer than the pine at the base of the slope. Always watching, never speaking, never stepping past the line where the grass gave way to stone. He stood with his hands at his sides, shoulders square, face unreadable, The forest behind him always moved just a little too much, like it was breathing with him. Patrick watched from the window. He didn't knock. He didn't call out. It had taken him years to realize that love had no leverage over nature. You couldn't coax it. You couldn't force it back inside a door it had already learned to leave behind. Elodie still asked, quietly, only at bedtime. Did he come tonight? Marielle would nod, brushing the girl's hair back behind her ear, folding the blanket up to her chin. Did he eat? Some. Will he come in? Marielle's answer never changed. Not yet. Snow began to stick early that year. By mid-October, the trees had hardened. The air stayed low, pressing on the house like memory. Inside, the rooms held silence like smoke. Elodie played softer now, more careful, like she didn't want to break something that had already started to crack. Patrick mended what he could. Tools, fences. The porch rail Kaelen once leaned against every morning. He never said much, but his movements were slower, less sure. His left knee started aching again. The cold crept into everything. Marielle kept the fire going longer each night. Still, they waited. Every few days, the bread would be gone. Not always. Sometimes the cup stayed full. Sometimes the bread froze over untouched. Those nights, Marielle would bring it in and warm the plate with her hands. She didn't cry, but she held the cup like something holy. Then came the first snow of November. It fell slow and quiet, blanketing the porch before sunrise. Marielle opened the door just after dawn and found the footprints. 2 of them. Not from boots. Bare. Heavy. 1 step on the porch. Just 1, right up to the edge of the threshold, and then nothing. She stared at it for a long time. Patrick joined her a minute later. He didn't ask what it meant. They both knew. He was trying. The next evening, she left 2 pieces of bread. This time he took both. December came sharp and early. The woods grew loud with silence. Crows left. Hares dug deeper. The sky kept its clouds low. Each dusk was a painting turned ash. One night the knock came. 3 slow, hollow strikes on the cedar post near the stairs. Not on the door, not on the wall. Just the post, just loud enough. Patrick stood first, but Marielle stepped out. And there he was, Kaelen, not hidden in the trees, not watching from a distance, standing in the snow, halfway to the house. His face older now, harder, but his eyes hadn't changed. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just looked at her like he was waiting for permission. She stepped aside, cleared the doorway. But he didn't move. The snow fell between them, soft and slow. Then, a sound behind him. Farther back. 3 more knocks. Kaelen turned slightly, shoulders tensed. Then he looked back at her and shook his head. Not no, just goodbye. He raised 1 hand, palm open, not waving, not reaching, just there. Then he turned, walked into the trees, and didn't look back. That night, Marielle didn't speak. She sat by the fire long after Elodie fell asleep, hands folded in her lap. Patrick laid a hand on her shoulder. She didn't flinch, just whispered. He almost came in. The next morning, the bread and cup were gone. Nothing left, not even a print, just a faint warmth on the step, like someone had sat there for a while, thinking. Inside, Elodie drew a picture of the porch. She put a figure standing on it, 1 foot forward, 1 foot back. And beside it, a boy made of charcoal lines in space. When Patrick asked who it was, she said, Kaelen. And the other? She looked up. Me, waiting. Snow kept falling. And somewhere beyond the trees, beyond the ridge, a shadow kept watch. Not vanishing, not lost, just on the other side of the door. The wedding was small, just like everything else in Elodie's life had been. Quiet, pine-framed, full of breath held between moments. She wore a pale green dress Marielle had kept boxed for years, pressed and refitted with hands that knew what loss had cost them. Her hair was braided with twine and cedar tips, soft curls tucked at the nape the way her mother used to do when she was sick. Patrick stood near the edge of the yard, arms crossed, not wanting to blink too long in case the whole thing turned out to be a dream. He had no toast prepared. No words scribbled in his pocket, just a tightness in his chest that only eased when she turned to look back at him, smiling, wide and whole. He didn't walk her down the aisle. She'd asked him not to. "I want you in the picture," she'd said, and that was that. So he stood on the side, one hand brushing the wooden post where Kaelen used to lean, and watched her say, "I do," with a man who had gentle eyes and calloused hands and didn't question the story she told at night. The kind of man who didn't try to fix anything that wasn't broken, who simply listened. There was no preacher, just wind, a scattering of pine cones, and 2 rings warmed in Marielle's old handkerchief. Marielle was not there. The cough had started in spring. Gentle, annoying. Then it settled deep into her chest by summer and never left. She kept baking, sewing, setting the table for 4 long after Kaelen stopped coming back. She lit the lantern at night, even when the porch stayed empty. But by the second frost, she stopped humming. By the first snow, she stopped eating. Patrick held her hand through the silence, kissed her palm every evening like a ritual. She never asked for more. The day she passed, the sky was white without movement. Patrick buried her beneath the red cedar she planted herself, just behind the shed where Kaelen once hid after breaking the ladder. He marked the grave with a wooden sign carved in quiet letters. Marielle Toussaint Callahan. Firekeeper, mother, shelter. He didn't invite anyone. Didn't need to. That evening, as he sat on the porch with a blanket over his knees and the journal open in his lap, a sound rose from the far hill. Not loud, just enough. A single long call, low, drawn like breath over stone. Patrick closed his eyes, whispered the name. "Kaelen!" He didn't cry. Not then. But the journal shook in his hand as he wrote the final line. "We can love them, but we cannot hold them." He folded the journal shut. The binding cracked. Inside, pressed between the last pages, was a cedar sprig, dried flat and curling at the edges. And tucked behind it, a small smudge of fur, darker than the others. Softer, like the last of something sacred. Years passed like fog rolling through the valley. Elodie and her husband moved to Revelstoke, where the trains ran louder and the streets smelled like tar instead of pine. They opened a small shop. She taught music. She sang softly when she was alone. And when their first child was born, she named him Callahan. Not for legacy, but for something she could not explain. She never said Kaelen's name again. But some nights, she left a piece of bread by the back steps. No butter, no honey, just warm and waiting. Patrick stayed behind in the old cabin until his hands stopped working and the stairs became too steep. Roger and Amanda packed up his things gently, wrapping every object like it could remember. The last thing they found was the journal, inside the lid of a cedar box, tucked under yellowed linen, tied with a length of frayed twine. Amanda opened it first. Her fingers traced the fading ink. Roger sat beside her, breath shallow. They read it in silence. Every page, every name, every small word that had survived the years. And at the bottom of the final entry, scribbled in the same hand, was a sentence they had heard before. Too many times to count. "I couldn't leave the child behind." Amanda closed the book and looked toward the window. Outside, the sun had dropped low over the ridge, setting the snow in orange. The porch was empty now, but there, in the last of the light, sat the old wooden cup, still upright, still clean, no cracks, no dust. Inside, the faintest trace of water shimmered, like it had just been poured, or had just been taken. And beyond the tree line, far enough to doubt but close enough to feel, came a sound, a single knock, then silence, then nothing. But she didn't look away, not yet. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones that roar, but the ones that linger, the ones whispered between the trees, folded into quiet rituals, or carried in the warmth of a cup left by a doorway. Stories where love isn't declared, it's shown. In a blanket laid out before snowfall, in bread torn by hand, not hunger. In the simple act of waiting, even when you know they may never come back. This wasn't a tale about winning or losing, about taming the unknown or conquering the wild. It was about holding space, for mystery, for memory, for the impossible truths that don't fit into neat boxes. It was about the courage to care, even when nothing is promised in return. About the weight of choosing to nurture what the world tells you to fear. In the quietest parts of our lives, we often forget that love doesn't always speak our language. It might come in unfamiliar forms, through gestures we don't understand at first. But it's real, and it's sacred. And when we choose compassion over control, when we choose patience over proof, something ancient inside us softens, grows, endures. The line between wild and human isn't drawn by blood or name. It's drawn by presence, by those moments where we show up for one another, not to own, not to fix, but simply to witness, to listen, to let be. Because sometimes the deepest kind of love is the kind that lets go without turning away. And even when someone walks beyond the reach of our arms, if they still live in the stories we tell, in the small kindnesses we offer, in the silences we choose to honor, they've never really left. So if this story touched you, if something in it stirred a memory, a question, or a feeling you can't quite name, please take a moment to share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear what stayed with you. And if you'd like to walk with us again through stories like this, stories that hold light in dark places and warmth in the coldest corners, don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe to the channel. Your presence here means more than you know. Thank you for listening. And wherever you are tonight, may you always find a light left on